Thank you, everybody, for coming this morning. There's a lot of talk about men's retreat, and I don't mean to belabor the point, but there was a time not too long ago where in my life I was very depressed, felt very alone, felt a bit hopeless about life circumstances, and an outsider looking in would go, "What's the problem?" But from the inside, there was a problem. And then I went to a men's retreat. Found out, I wasn't alone. Found out there are men who have walked the road ahead of me and could look back and go, "Here's the way." So if you haven't been and you're like, "I don't really feel like going. I don't have any friends there. I'm alone. I don't really have time. I don't really have the money," you actually are missing out on a life-changing opportunity. It will change the trajectory of your faith and of your walk with the Lord. So, please come. All right, so last week we started part one of Deuteronomy and Matthew. If you were here, hopefully that was interesting to you. And if you missed that, you can get the last week's message online. You can go to the church website and find that. Just in a brief review here, just to try to catch everybody up to speed, I'll go through this very quickly, and then we'll get on to our part two today. And part two, I'm really going to focus in on Matthew. You know, last week we gave a lot of background on kind of Deuteronomy, some Old Testament concepts, and hopefully to create some context for what we are reading as we go through our church Bible reading schedule. Today, we're going to focus in very specifically on Matthew, and I really only make it through 4 verses, so there you go. So last week, we talked about the connection between the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy and the New Testament Gospel of Matthew. Obviously, since we are reading through that as a church Bible reading schedule, you can get that on the app, or we have those at the back or at the receptionist desk when you come in. As a brief recap, Deuteronomy represented Moses' farewell address to the nation of Israel at that time. It was written in contractual form, so it represented this all-encompassing agreement between God and the people of Israel, okay? So this was, like I said, a contractual agreement in that this is what the nation of Israel used as the framework for the culture that was developed in their now settled land that God had promised to them, okay? So it created this framework for them. It was the law that the people, the Jewish people were living by at the time that Jesus came, okay? So Moses had delivered this address to the people of Israel somewhere around, the 1200s BC. So for 1200 years or so, this is what they were using as their cultural framework, okay, through a number of different circumstances. So that's where they were when Jesus came along. The Gospel of Matthew, we see Jesus breaking into this culture and kind of turning it upside down. Not changing it from throwing it away, but living it from a sinless perspective, okay? So, when we read through the Gospel of Matthew, it's really helpful for us to understand what the people at the time were thinking, get into their mindset, so that who Jesus is, how he is presented, can take on a fuller meaning to us today, okay? So, very few people really probably value history just for history's sake. It's can be interesting. Some of us like to read about history, but lots of us, we just kind of, that was fine for then, but who really cares today? It should provoke that question. Yeah, that's fine back then, but I need to know, how is God moving in my world today? Because this is when I need him. This is when I want to see him show up. Our world is a mess. Where is he? Isn't that what we're supposed to learn? We don't need to learn about what happened 1,200 some years ago. We need to know where he is right now. Hopefully that's what you're going to see today, okay? So I wanted to illustrate the additional value and insight we can have by viewing Matthew's gospel through the lens of the Jews of the day rather than just through our own modern understanding. And hopefully that will bring some light about who Jesus is today and how we can interact with him right now. So if you would please rise, we're going to read, our scripture reading today comes from Matthew chapter 8. We're going to read verses 1 through 4. We'll read those together. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately he was cleansed from his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." Very good. All right, you may be seated. So this is our story for this morning. So keep in mind, the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew, who was one of Jesus' disciples, and it was written to recount the life of Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection, and his subsequent influence in that day and on into the future. It was written to attract the Jews, draw them into an interaction with Jesus, and then provide a chain reaction of the spread of the gospel. So one of Matthew's primary objectives in writing his gospel was to present Jesus as the Jewish Messiah sent by God to fulfill Old Testament prophecy. That is why he organizes the content in his gospel the way that he does. He emphasizes the information that would speak to the Jews and attract them to Jesus. So from some commentary here, I'm just going to read a little bit here. It can kind of help paint a picture of Matthew's audience. Okay, he didn't write to the United States of America in the year 2023. We weren't in his mind. Okay, though as Americans, we often think we were. Right? Of course, he was writing it to us. Like, the world revolves around us. Yeah, no, it doesn't. He didn't write it to you, but we can learn a lot from it. Okay. Because Jewish thinking took many forms in different parts of the ancient world, it's valuable to be more precise in this case. So, whereas Jewish people who liked apocalyptic literature would particularly appreciate Revelation, Jews in the diaspora would appreciate Hebrews, and groups such as the Essenes might appreciate John's Gospel, Matthew often moves in a more rabbinic thought world. That is, the views and arguments of teachers and interpreters of the law who came to be called rabbis are very relevant to Matthew's gospel. Most of the sources from which we know rabbinic thought are later, but they offer numerous parallels to Matthew's way of handling Scripture and an intimate understanding of the Pharisaic debates with Jesus. And because Jesus was himself a sage and engaged in discussion and often debate with Pharisaic teachers, Matthew continues to engage in a world within which Jesus himself moved. So you can see from this, as Matthew is picturing his audience, and all writers picture an audience. You know, when I'm writing a message, I'm thinking, who's listening out there? I always think Rick Grunwald is, because he's always listening. Would Rick care what I have to say? Because if the answer is no, then I'm not going to say it, right? So we always picture an audience. And so Matthew was picturing his audience of being people who had studied the law and that were following the law and were teaching the law. Okay, so that's why he organizes the content in his gospel the way that he does. And you might, those of you who are familiar with the other gospels might find, oh, this is recorded slightly differently. Different audience in mind. Okay, not that the content is compromised because it's different, but it was written in a way to speak to a different audience. Okay, so Matthew, his audience were these teachers of the law of the time. So that's why he's going to say some of the things that he does. So the story that we're reading here in chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, it is one story in the midst of a grouping of healings. So the subsequent stories, so verses 5 on through 17, are different healings. So this one was a man with leprosy had come to Jesus and said, look, you know, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus said, I'm willing, and he heals him. The subsequent stories right after that are different healings. Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. He heals a centurion's servant. And there's also a kind of, Matthew kind of writes it as, and there's a bunch of other people. You know, he just kind of throws it out there like that. The culmination of this grouping of healings ends with Matthew 8:17. says, this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. Okay, so that's his point of his message. Look, Jesus is the Messiah. Because what he just said there, he took up our infirmities and bore our diseases, he's referring to the prophet Isaiah chapter 53, which all Jews and teachers of the law would know that Isaiah chapter 53 is talking about the promised Messiah. That's why he's bringing it up this way. So Isaiah 53, 4 through 5, it says, surely he took our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. So that's what Matthew is referring back to. Look, these stories happened, these healings happened, and we expected healings to happen from the Messiah. And look at what he did here today is what Isaiah was talking about back then. That's his point, okay? So he's the guy. He's the guy. By the first century, Judaism had developed a list of major signs that the Messiah could be expected to give as proof of his identity. Healing a leper was one of them. So why? Okay, well, most every commentary that I read or Bible dictionary explains leprosy this way. It's not leprosy. So there was the disease of leprosy that we know today, where your skin is basically bacteria is eating your skin, and it's a fatal disease if it's not treated. Well, it was discovered in the 1800s, okay, and kind of given a name then. When they talk in Scripture about leprosy, it likely was not that same disease. It was likely a general skin disorder. Okay, and it didn't necessarily mean it was a fatal disorder. It just meant you have a rash, and we don't know what it is. And so there was these different treatments that protocols that they would go through. So when we say a leper, what we really mean here is a man with a skin disorder, and we don't know the severity of it. We do know that skin disorders were huge problems in their time. And the reason we know that is in the book of Leviticus, there's 2 whole chapters dedicated to skin disorders. So I thought it'd be fun if we read through those this morning. Just bring a little extra content, a little context. We'll just read through 2 chapters. Come on, 2 chapters? There's way less content directed towards do not murder than there is what to do about skin disorders. You know, it's like Moses was a dermatologist or something. He got real detailed about what to do with skin disorders. Now, what that tells us is it was a big deal. It was common, and it was a problem, okay? And it created problems. Now, some of what you will read there in Leviticus 13 and 14, and we're not going to go through. I'm not going to read any of it, don't worry. But some of what you're going to read, you're going to find is the protocols. What do you do? Oh, well, basically, if you have a rash, you have a skin disorder, you have to go show yourself to the priest. And then the priest would be like, yep, you have a rash. You need to go outside the camp. You're unclean, okay? And part of this is to protect from the spread of disease. Because as we know, diseases that are contagious can be catastrophic. We kind of experienced this in the last few years as we were dealing with a worldwide pandemic, and put all of your political beliefs aside, the fact is it was very contagious, okay? And there were all kinds of things that we were trying to put in place to prohibit the spread of disease. Whether you believe they work or not, that's what was happening, okay? And so it's very similar in the context of, well, if you have the sniffles, go get your COVID test. If you test positive, you got to go into quarantine for however many days. And then if somebody else, you've been in contact with somebody who has it, you got to be in quarantine for however many days. Like you could spend weeks after weeks after weeks basically in isolation with COVID. That's kind of what happens here. There's this description, you have this skin disorder. Well, we don't know how severe it is, so you need to go be in isolation. We'll check in a week, and we'll see what it did. If it changed this way, that way, or whatever, then we'll change our diagnosis. Maybe you have to go be isolated again, or maybe you're good to go. Because your skin disorder could be a viral infection that's extremely contagious, and if somebody else gets it, it's going to keep spreading, and it's going to wipe out a bunch of people. Or it could be a food allergy, That's not going to be contagious. And so depending on what they would find, how it was responding, they would make a diagnosis. And this is all detailed in Leviticus, right? Okay. So when this man, this leper with the skin disorder, right? This man with the skin disorder comes to Jesus, note what he says. He says, Jesus, if you are willing, you can make me clean. You know, he did not ask for his skin to be healed. So it may be, this is now my conjecture here, is that it's possible that the disorder that he was suffering from was not the main problem that he was suffering from. It's the residual effects of being isolated, of being in quarantine. How many of you have to spend time in quarantine and you're like, I'm going to go crazy? Some of you are like, this is a blessing. Because there's a lot of people I don't want to see right now, and so this is great. It's refreshing and it's fine. But after a while, it really can be a strain. You know, to be separated from community, to be separated from purpose, to be separate, like to be told you don't have value enough to be with us, just go out there and get better. That can create strain. And that's actually what the man was asking for. Jesus, can you make me clean so I can be returned to society, so I can return to my family, so I can return to my job, so I can return to doing what I love to do. I don't like this is causing great pain for me to be isolated out here. These are all of the thoughts and understandings that Matthew's audience would immediately have known. Skin disorder? Ooh, that's a problem. That's a big deal. Not just because it might be a life-threatening condition, but it's an emotionally damaging condition. It's a spiritually damaging condition. And it's really uncontrolled by the person who is suffering from it. It's a problem. It's a big problem. So, in Deuteronomy, one of the things, Jesus does address the skin disorder slightly. He says, in the case of defiling skin diseases, be very, very careful to do exactly as the Levitical priests instruct you. You must follow carefully what I have commanded them. So he just gives a little shout out. Hey, go back and read Leviticus. Okay, we won't, but that's what he does. Additionally, in the Old Testament, because this was such a regularly occurring issue, it is also common that God shows himself powerful over skin disease. Okay? So there are different instances and examples where God heals somebody miraculously, takes it away. Even when Moses was going to Pharaoh, or going to go to the people and say, hey, listen, I'm going to lead you guys out of slavery. Okay, we're going to leave Egypt. And Moses was kind of arguing with God, and he's like, God, I don't know if they're going to believe me. Why would they believe me? I don't know that I'm really that great of a leader, and I don't know that I speak all that well. And so God tells Moses, he says, take your staff, throw it on the ground, and it turns into a snake. And he says, grab it by the tail, and he picks it up, and it turns back into a staff. And he says, this is a sign that you'll be able to use so the people will believe that I'm with you. And then he said this. He said, take your hand and put it in your cloak, and then take it out, and it became leprous. It was white as snow. He immediately had a skin disease. And he said, put it back in, and then take it back out, and it was healed. He's like, this is another sign that you can show the people that I am with you. Okay, so it was a common enough thing. Serpents and skin diseases were like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. You know, he didn't say, I'm going to make your head spin around, off your body. He's like, I'm going to heal your hand. Okay, and there's an instance where Moses' sister, Miriam, she ends up leprous, and then God heals her, okay? So these things happen frequently because it's a major part of their culture. So if you take all of that information with you and you read this, then when you see, a man with skin disease comes to Jesus, you can see why he might be attracted to Jesus. Because here's this problem. Here's this issue that if it could change, this man gets his life back. So my first point this morning is this attraction. Jesus possessed the power to change what is into what should be. For Matthew's audience, the attraction to Jesus is shown, as Jesus is shown to be the Messiah. So for us today, the attraction to Jesus can be both. Having a need healed, but it also can be taking an outcast or someone who's isolated and feeling lonely and putting them in community and having a healing happen. Both are real. The major problem that we all have to face is that sin is actually a big deal. And sometimes I think that we minimize it a little bit. And we kind of think, well, yeah, I mean, I need Jesus to forgive me of my sins in order to get into heaven. And that is true. That's super true. He is the way, the truth, and the life, and no man goes to the Father except by him. However, sin is very damaging in our life on a daily basis. It creates destruction. And we don't give it the space that we think. We think, well, there's lots of options for solving the problems that we face. There might be great strategies that can mitigate some of the problems that we deal with, either on a personal level or on a regional level, on a national level. There are ways that we can get around this. There was some articles recently, some things that are going on in our country right now where book banning is kind of a big deal. They're trying, people are like, hey, freaking out about what books are in libraries and the schools, and some of them are books that are considered, too violent or pornographic or things like that, and so the conservative parents are going, get those out, and then there's been some backlash going, oh yeah? Well, we want to get the Bible out of there too, okay? Because it's got violence, and it's got, talks about sex way too much, and it's got all these, difficult adult type of issues in there, and so we want to get that out too. So they're revolting. There's letters to the editor being written, and to be perfectly honest, when I would read the arguments for people who want the Bible to not be in school libraries, they have some valid points. It's not really kid friendly because sin is very destructive. But here's the difference between what the Bible has to say. Well, let me say this. This is one of the differences, okay, between what the Bible has to say and what all the other content that is available. Because you can go find content that will, one, glorify sin. You can find content that will help you learn how to sin. You can find content that will tell you what the penalties for sin can look like. You can find content for how to manage sin, but the Bible's the only one that gives content for a solution for sin. Okay? And so if the solution is found in the content, that's the one we need to know about. Because we were not going to find a solution for sin by managing better. It doesn't go away. It just proliferates in another way. We have these weeds in our yard, and I've talked about them. That's like, we thought they were bamboo. It's actually a noxious weed. We used to try to sell it, and it found out that was a bad idea. Okay, but so we're like, we are going to get rid of this stuff, and we've sprayed it over and over and over and over again, and it just kind of fights through, and it's really resilient. This year, we covered it. We covered up our weeds. Follow me now. The weeds are sin. We covered it. We got black plastic out there over this weed, and you know what? It's kind of poking up, and it's finding its way out around the sides. And it's like, oh, look at that. It actually grew over there this year instead of over here where we covered it. Because in order to deal with sin, you got to dig it up by the roots. That's what Jesus is. That's what Jesus does, and he's the only one. If Jesus is only one of your options for solutions, you are not going to get the healing that he can provide. When Jesus is the one where you come to and you fall on your knees before him and you say, if you are willing, you can heal me. If you are willing, you can heal me. You're my only hope. That's when the healing is going to happen. When you say, yeah, if you heal me, that'll be great. But if you don't, at least I can have a drink and kick the can down the road. Oh, if you could heal me, that'd be great. But I don't know if I really have time to commit myself to following you because I really like the pull of money. If you can heal me, that'd be great, but I think that we can find some other strategies. You know what? You're going to be doing that for the rest of your life, and you're not going to get the healing that you need. When Jesus is your answer, he's the only answer. That's what Matthew's trying to communicate. He is the Messiah. He came. We know this because of the signs. That's what the attraction is. Romans 3:23, it says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." But Romans 6:23 said the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Jesus, Christ our Lord. Okay, let's move on. Number 2, there's an interaction. So we go back to our original text here, verses 3 and 4. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. He said, "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them." You see, when this man, who was considered unclean, came to Jesus, knowing he was unclean, he knew the rules, he knew how this should play out, and he said, "If you're willing, you can make me clean." He didn't say, "If you're willing, you'll touch me." He didn't ask for that. He asked to be made clean. Jesus initiated the touch. That would have made Jesus unclean by their rules. But Jesus was willing to risk that. And you know what? We read here that as Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. This did not happen in isolation. It didn't happen behind closed doors. It happened right out there in front of everybody to see. Did you see what Jesus did? He touched the leper. He's got cooties. And all of that fades away when the man is miraculously healed. See, Jesus was able to go across the cultural barrier. And in some ways it looks like, well, he broke the rules. And then it also looks like, well, he's making up his own rules. And that's what I love about Jesus, because, some people love rules. How many of you, you're like, just give me some rules and help me follow them because I love them. Colt's like, yeah, give me the rules and I'll follow them. And you're like, that's really great. Other people are like, I like to make my own rules up. Don't ever tell me what to do. Mary. Scott's like, oh my gosh. And that's why Jesus is so cool, because he can be attractive to all of us. We're like, the rule followers, he's following the rules because he tells the leper to go back and see the priest. And the non-rule followers are like, I love that he just touched him. He's just like, he's living by his own rules that he makes up, because he's saying the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself, and I will touch him. Jesus is living by his own rules. But there's an interaction that takes place. Jesus illustrates the concept of this is what it looks like to love your neighbor as yourself. I am going to reach across the cultural barrier. I am going to touch him and bring healing. I am going to move towards you. I don't care what all these people think. Then Jesus points the man back to the priests to adhere to the Jewish law. You see, he was healed, presumably of his skin disease, because Jesus said, I'm willing, and made him clean. So presumably, that means whatever issue he had going on went away, okay? But yet he still needed to go back to the religious leaders who had sent him away, basically go back to the doctor and show yourself so he can say, yeah, in fact, you are no longer infected with whatever was going on, and you are going to, you're clean, but we're going to say, yeah, you're good. You can return to your household. You can return back into normal life. That's where healing really was taking place. So there was actually, the physical healing was one part. The restorative healing was the second part, right? Not every healing is an instantaneous change. Some happen over time. Some happen as we get reintroduced and plugged into community. Some happen as you go to a men's retreat and you find out, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one trying to struggle through this life, and there's people who have gone before me who can speak to where I am now and can give me a hope and can help me put my hand in Jesus and be able to walk with him. Some healings happen over time. Okay, so there was this attraction to Jesus. There's an interaction with Jesus, but then Jesus, he had planned a chain reaction. Okay, so if we see back our original text again here, chapter 8, verses 3 through 4, Jesus reached out his hand. He touched the man. I am willing, he said. Be clean. And immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, see that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourselves to the priests and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. You see, the healing provoked the testimony. See, in the early part of his ministry, Jesus did not publicize the fact that he was the Messiah. Because the people expected a Messiah who would liberate Israel from Rome and rule in glory, not one who would die a criminal's death. That was not the expectation. Jesus instructs the man to go do what the law commands after recovery from this skin disease, and this sends a message to the religious establishment that the Messiah has come and is at work, doing what only the Messiah can do. You see, the testimony to the people is to go through the channels initially through the leadership. So this man who was healed, Jesus wanted him to go back to the priests, and the priests would be like, how did this happen? And he could be like, well, the healer came. There's a man out in the wilderness where I was wandering in isolation, and I came to him, I asked him, I said, can you heal me? And he healed me. And they'd be like, that's one of the signs of the Messiah. You see, Jesus wasn't trying to create an uproar. He was trying to influence on a personal level. And he was trying to get the influence at the priestly level at that moment. That was his strategy, to start getting that group of people, the teachers of the law, the people who were leading all the rest of the nation, to get them in. He's trying to let them know. Get a testimony to where they're going to hear it in a way that they're going to see that. Go, this is a real deal. And they're expecting, those people are expecting signs just like this one. That's why Matthew writes it the way he does, and it is why Jesus refers him back to the priest. He could have just said, yeah, go home, you're clean, right? I'm doing everything different. I'm making my own rules. But that's not what he did. He sent him back. The healing, it was kind of like, when you throw a rock into the water and you get the ripples. The healing was the rock, but then that testimony became the ripple effect. And Jesus says in chapter 13, verse 33, he told them a parable. He said, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough. So what he's saying is, like yeast, if the kingdom of heaven is like yeast, and you put it into a community, it works itself through. Okay? When that man went back to give his testimony to the priests, that became an opportunity for that yeast, the kingdom of heaven, the truth, the Messiah has come to start working its way through the people. You know what? When you have a healing in your life, and you've come and you've said, Jesus, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And he does. Whether that happens instantaneously or over time, you have a testimony of the reality of how Jesus works in our life today. And you're like, I know it doesn't seem like it should work this way, but God healed my heart. God saved me from sin. God is continuing to save me from sin, because sin's a big deal. Sin's influential in all that I'm doing. It's there, ready, and I didn't even know I was tempted to do those things until I found myself doing them. But Jesus continues to save. Jesus continues to heal. Jesus continues to meet me in that. You have a testimony. And that's what people need to know, because the kingdom of God, it's influenced person to person. It's influenced by those testimonies. So when you have a healing, now you have a testimony that can help influence another. So as we kind of go through the rest of Matthew, what we need to be doing is looking at this going, how could the Jews have thought about this? How could Matthew's audience have thought about this? And then how can I see Jesus as, he's way cooler than you think. Amen. He really is. And you might think he's really cool. And he's way cooler than that, because he's doing so many different things at one time. So as we wrap it up here this morning, I know we're going to do communion, and CJ's going to come up and he's going to lead us through that. I want you to think about this, though. What is it that attracted you to Jesus? What is it that maybe it was a long time ago, maybe it was recently, maybe you're still trying to go, I'm not sure I am. What is it that attracted you? Possibly you had the awareness of a need. Possibly you had an awareness that there was something that you couldn't strategize yourself out of anymore. Something that all the world's best options just seemed to leave you still empty. I remember way back when I was a college student, I came to college here, and there was just this gaping hole in my heart. And I tried so many different ways to try to fill that hole. Like, I was aware of the need, but I didn't even know, I couldn't verbalize how much of a vacuum it was creating in my life. But I could see how, I'm trying to fill that with some sort of significance. And so I would set my sights on, if I can become somebody really, really important to lots of people, that's going to fill that hole. So I was convinced I was going to become a professional football player. Because that's an obvious transition, right? But I wanted to be a professional football player so that I could become an actor. Because that's the natural progression. Because the pinnacle was stand-up comedy, and that's really where I was headed. Okay? But see, that gripped my heart. Like, I was like, this is gonna make me whole. This is gonna be real for me. This is what's gonna make me important to other people, and that's gonna fill that gap, And when that kind of stuff, I came to some realization of reality, which is hard for 18-year-olds to do. But when I came to those realizations that, this isn't, one, that's not going to happen, then what's going to happen with this vacancy that's in my heart? What am I going to do? That's a really hopeless kind of scenario. But then Jesus came. And when I saw people that had something in their life that I had never seen before. It was in their eyes. And I walked around here, and people were like genuinely happy and free. And there was a reality to a relationship with a God that I'd never seen before. I'm like, what is that? How do you get that? How do I get that and then become a professional football player? I still got some eligibility left, so, you guys seen the rookie? I'm gonna make the league. Yeah, I'm working on that. So, anyway, point being, when Jesus is the one that you finally realize he can answer this question, he's the one that can fill this hole, he's the one that can heal, that's when you have that testimony after that interaction with him. So remember what it is that attracted you to him. What was your interaction with him like? What was that exchange? And who can benefit from hearing that testimony? CJ, I'll give it to you.